Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Aparna Vatve, faculty of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This module is about international environmental movements. In this, we will look at developing countries as well as developed countries. The environmental movements in both have some similarities and some differences. At the end of the module, we will compare the different examples. Environmental movements are basically social movements. They are meant for environmental causes. The issues of environmental degradation, loss of resources, loss of species and ecosystems are common everywhere. Environmentalists try to promote sustainable management. For this, they are willing to address lacunae in the national and international laws and public policy. Activists have tried to change individual behavior and create awareness regarding collective goods of nature conservation. All these can be classified as environmental movements. Environmental movements in developed and developing countries have a very different history. Major Indian environmental movements originated from local communities which were trying to defend their rights and self-governance. Similar movements have taken place in Asia and Africa. In South America also, we see the examples of environmentalism of the poor communities. One of the most famous of the African environmental leaders was Wangari Muta Maathai. In the early 1970s, the Kenyan government started a program of large-scale deforestation. They wanted to increase agriculture and cities. Wangari became aware of the environmental impacts of this program. It was going to degrade Kenya's land. It was going to affect the forest and people, mainly the tribals. In areas where deforestation took place, the farmlands quickly turned to arid, desert-like areas. This deprived countless communities of the resources that they needed for survival. Just like the women in India, the women in Africa are also responsible for collection of fuel wood, water and fodder for their houses. The women were greatly affected by the deforestation. Wangari Maathai was a savior to them. She founded the Greenbelt Movement. This was a grassroots movement to protect environment. She launched a lifelong campaign to put a stop to Kenya's environmental degradation. Maathai's one goal was to protect the environment, but she did not stop at that. She also tried to empower women to take good decisions. She was also suggesting family planning, education, health, and many other social changes. The women farmers started to plant green belts. These were the line of plants to fight soil erosion. In her own words, women who start to plant trees on their farms influence their neighbors. Their neighbors eventually become involved. Now we see the government reacting. Wangari Maathai was awarded Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. The Greenbelt Movement's work still continues. It is not limited to tree planting. Maathai also worked in cooperation with the National Council of Women of Kenya. They provided many services to the Kenyan women. The movement educated thousands of low-income women about forestry and created jobs. Another prominent example is of a movement in Brazil. Amazonian rainforests of Brazil are world's richest rainforest. They have the highest biodiversity in the entire world. Many different indigenous communities live in the forest. They have been living there for centuries. They are completely dependent on the rainforest for their survival. Chico Mendes was born in 1944 in Puerto Rico in the state of Amazonia. His home was in the forest land which surrounded the Amazon River. All of Mendes' family was rubber workers. These were people who extracted latex from the rubber trees and cured the substance for sale in the market. This was important for production of rubber. The rubber lords were often very cruel. Their workers was kept in inhuman conditions. They were not allowed access to education because they feared that there will be an uprising against the bad conditions. Mendes' father was the first among the tappers to learn to read, and his son benefited from this. In the beginning, Mendes tried to bring out a change in the inhuman working conditions. He wrote to the Brazil government and asked them to look at the poor conditions of rubber workers. In the 1970s and late 80s, there was sporadic violence in the regions of rainforest. At the same time, synthetic rubber was produced in the world. There was now no need for rubber or latex from the Amazonian rainforest. Livelihoods of rubber tappers were at risk because the latex industry was failing. In the 1970s and 80s, there was sporadic violence in the regions of the rainforest. At this time, the synthetic rubber industry emerged. This was an alternative to the natural rubber which was coming from Amazons. Because of synthetic rubber, there was no demand now for latex, and the livelihoods of the rubber workers of Amazon were at risk. The regional government only wanted to look at the economy, and for gaining money, they gave away parts of rainforest to the cattle ranchers. The cattle ranchers came in and started to cut the rainforest. They took the land from the rubber lords. They cut and burned the rainforest land and displaced rubber workers and other indigenous communities. This was resisted by many people. There were union protests and an organized movement grew in area. Mendes was the leader for many of these. He organized unions and looked at alliances of all the unions in the area. As the union gained strength, the workers tried to prevent the cattle ranchers from cutting down the rainforest. They started to blockade the areas. There were bands of tappers who traveled to the forest areas and destroyed the ranchers' areas. The logging crews were stopped from working and they were forced out of the area. A few people were killed in the violence. The ranchers singled out activists, priests, lawyers, union presidents, and even some squatters, and they murdered them using hired gunmen. In 1981, Mendes persuaded the tappers to form cooperative business. They tried to sell the latex directly. This would eliminate the rubber lords. This system was quite successful. Mendes took a new approach which focused world's attention on the importance of Brazilian rainforest. He convinced them that we need to let go of the rubber issue and instead politicize the issue of preservation of rainforest. He stressed to the world that the value of other forest products like oils, nuts and cocoa can finance the protection of rainforest. The tappers now demanded a system of land which could be reformed to include extractive reserves. They allocated areas of the rainforest for rubber and nut harvesting in a sustainable manner. Mendes won 2 awards in 1987, the Global 500 Award and the Protection of the Environment Medal. In 1988, Mendes was murdered by the cattle ranchers. It drew global attention. His death focused the world's attention on the cause of the rainforest. It also focused attention on possibility of sustainable management and extractive reserves. Brazil passed new law. They approved plantation of 2.5 million acres of rainforest which was destroyed in the last decades. The government created extractive reserves in the Amazonian region. The first ever reserve was named Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve. It serves as a home and refuge to tappers and farmers. Today, Brazil nut, timber and many other products are sustainably harvested from the extractive reserves. This is a viable alternative to the local community, and the economy prospers without clearing the rainforest. Environmental history in West Africa has also been quite violent. Nigeria has seen many conflicts over natural resources. Nigeria has rich forest and wetland ecosystems, which is inhabited by several tribes and other indigenous communities. But the region also has very rich oil deposits. For several years, Nigeria had a military government. They supported foreign agencies and businesses to come and extract resources of oil. The military government helped the foreign agencies to come to Nigeria and extract oil at cheap price. Royal Dutch Shell Company struck oil in the land of the Ogoni people sometime around 1958. The extraction was highly polluting. Ogoni farmers and fishermen suffered because of the pollution. The land was degraded, there was oil everywhere, fish and all wildlife died out because of the pollution. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a well-known Nigerian author and television producer. He was president of the Movement for the Survival of Ogoni People, MOSOP. The organization defended Ogoni land and tried to establish the human rights violations in the region. In 1993, Saro-Wiwa gathered 300,000 Ogoni people to march peacefully and demand share of the oil revenue. They demanded political autonomy. MOSOP also asked the oil companies to start the process of remediation of the damage that they had done. In 1994, Saro-Wiwa was put in jail. He was charged falsely with murder. All national and international environmental agencies, governments of countries got involved in this issue. They requested Nigerian government to spare Saro-Wiwa's life, but there was no pardon for Saro-Wiwa. Even today, the Ogoni region remains heavily militarized. There has been no independent environmental assessment of Shell's pollution in the Niger Delta. We have now looked at different movements in the developing countries. The environmental in developed countries were quite different. Their first focus was on romantic and poetic values of nature. People wanted to conserve nature because it was beautiful. Very often there was a sense of nostalgia attached to nature conservation. Nature was seen as something far away from human influence. The first prominent environmental movement was in England in 1865. It was to preserve the commons, which were the open lands which had nature and people could go and enjoy the nature. In Europe and America, environmental conservation was mostly demanded by the rich and elite groups. In the later period, scientists started to play an important role in the nature conservation. New organizations were formed. Scientists argued that conservation of natural elements is necessary to stop extinction of species. Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, launched an appeal in newspapers for collections of donations. It involved people from all classes. Today, it is the world's leading nature conservation organization. In 1962, Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring. It changed the environmental consciousness in the developed world. The impacts of pollution were clearly seen. People started to understand the link between environmental degradation, ecosystems, and human health. Many environmental organizations in other countries have used very strong radical activism techniques. Greenpeace is one of them. Greenpeace acts to change the attitude and behavior of people. Its aim is to conserve environment and to promote peace. In 1971, America was conducting underground nuclear testing in Amchitka, which is a tiny island near the west coast of Alaska. A team of Greenpeace activists sailed from Vancouver in Canada, and they sailed in an old fishing boat. The island was the last refuge of 3,000 endangered sea otters and bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and many other wildlife was seen in the islands. They said that they only wanted to be the witness of all the destruction that the nuclear testing will cause. Greenpeace mission was stopped on the way. They were not allowed to continue, but their journey involved a lot of public interest. In the same year, the nuclear testing in Amchitka was ended and the island was created into a sanctuary. Since then, Greenpeace has been campaigning against climate change and forest destruction. They have also campaigned against the pollution by hazardous waste. Very often they are labeled as anti-development. Even in India, they were under surveillance because of their activities of environmental conservation. Some of the activities have been quite radical, but they have always been non-violent. In recent times, ethical issues and animal rights issues have been mixed with the environmental movements. Biodiversity scientists have taken a lead role. The question they ask is, do we have the right to destroy what we cannot create? Some of the activists talk about equal rights to all the species that exist on Earth. One of the cases of scientists turning into an activist is of Diane Fosse. Diane Fosse worked on the mountain gorillas, which are an endangered species in the area of Virunga Mountains. In the 1970s, she studied a group of mountain gorillas in the border of Rwanda, Congo and Uganda. She worked there for 18 years. In 1967, Fosse founded the Karisoke Research Center. It was a remote rainforest camp. She tried her best to prevent poaching of mountain gorillas, but some of her efforts were not liked by the local people. She was very passionate, but did not think about the laws and did not try to get local support for conservation. In 1885, she was murdered in her center. Her murderers were never found. In the same way, many initiatives have been started by other biologists. Saving the whales, saving the dolphins, saving the orangutans, saving chimpanzees are some of these movements. But none of them have been as controversial as Diane Fosse. In most of the cases, saving a species leads to conflict with the local communities. The tiger is an impressive species. The global community knows that it has to be saved. But for the local community, tiger is an animal which is a danger to their property and their lives. How do we bridge these two different opinions? That has been a major problem in saving species. In the last 3 decades, the whole focus of environmental movement has shifted towards climate change. Global warming is a threat to all. It has bridged the gap between environmental movements in the developed and developing countries. It is viewed in different ways from both sides. For the developed country people, environmental change leads to excessive droughts, heat and heat waves. For the developing country people, it is also leading to loss of livelihoods and large areas. Climate activism began sometime in the 1990s. By 2000, many organizations were formed just to look at climate change. Awareness about climate change grew because of a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. It was about the former United States Vice President Al Gore's campaign to stop climate change and educate people about it. It raised a lot of interest. Today, we have many good documentaries about how climate change is affecting people in India. There have been several marches of thousands of people across the world to educate people about climate change and its impact. Over the past 2 decades, the environmental movements from different parts of the world are coming together. They are coming together under common banners. Rise of social media and multinational conservation campaigns by NGOs have helped in connecting the environmental leaders. It is not always a peaceful process because the values of society in different countries are always different. There are ways of creating awareness which are also different. Western organizations continue to focus on science, technology, and rights of organisms. But Asian organizations focus on inclusive and sustainable development. They believe in participatory management of nature. In many cases, they try to promote conservation using traditional and cultural values. But all organizations agree on one thing. They always take a peaceful and non-violent action for conservation of nature. In a rapidly globalizing world, all types of environmental movements are needed to combine and work towards the common goal. In this module, we looked at some of the movements outside India. We also tried to see how they differed in the developed and developing countries. If you are interested in this topic, you can take a look at the essential reading that is accompanying this module. You can also read the e-text which is written about this module. I hope you have enjoyed this and hope to see you again. Thank you.